Hello everyone and welcome to Keen Ear, and I guess this is a sequel to the previous video that I uploaded, in which I was talking about the Beatles, and I was speculating quite heavily on the concept of them not actually splitting up back in 1917 and carrying on further into the 70s at the very least, and what that would have kind of resulted in, and what kind of sound they'd have had, and all that kind of thing. What would have been the reaction, and to their just existence into the 70s, on the landscape of popular music and that sort of thing. But one of the things I forgot to talk about, which I really did want to talk about, and it just completely slipped my mind. Could really do with maybe making notes for some of these videos. But one of the things that I really wanted to talk about was the idea of John Lennon, and if he had have lived, I did talk about what his solo career would have been like, but if he'd have lived, further on, say if he'd lived as long, for instance, as George Harrison had lived, into the past the year 2000, could the concept of some sort of reunion been on the cards? At all, really. And I don't think this is necessarily a complete and total sort of flight of fancy idea that it just wouldn't have happened. I actually think it's kind of would have been very likely we would have had a reunion at least sometime, perhaps not the 1980s, but I think when you think of the 1990s, with the anthology project that came about, which was kind of the closest we got to a proper reunion as we could have at that time. All three surviving members working together on a Beatles track that John Lennon was, had written, and had his, stuff like Free as a Bird and that sort of thing. That was kind of like the closest we could have really got to a proper reunion. Of course, if John was around, he, unless he completely objected to being in it, he would have, of course, been part of that, and that would have been a Beatles reunion of some kind. That would have been at least one example of a reunion that we possibly could have had, a complete reunion. So I don't think it would have been necessarily a complete, unlikely event to happen, a complete flight of fancy, and it wouldn't have happened. And you got to look at the facts as well. Back in 1980, the way things were, John and Paul were on decent speaking terms for the first time in a long time, since the 1960s, effectively. They patched things up. Paul has gone on record saying that, he was very relieved, for obvious reasons, that he managed to patch things up with John, before he was murdered. So, that was something at the very least. John had also started recording again, so he'd re-entered the world as a recording artist, so that that would have had at least some impact again on a reunion. It's not like he was he was just living a family life like he had been previously, and he wasn't interested in recording or being a musician necessarily. So there was that. There was also the fact that the Wings, Paul McCartney and Wings had broken up. So Paul was now a free agent, by 1980. And he could kind of do what he wanted. He didn't have to juggle between being in two bands at the same time, one of which being, the Beatles potentially, if a reunion was on the cards. And you've got Ringo, of course, who, would have jumped at the chance of a reunion. I think if he'd have got a phone call from any of the Beatles saying, we want to rejoin and we kind of need you to come along, I pretty much guarantee he would have jumped at the chance. I don't think he'd have slammed the phone down and been angry and not been interested or whatever. So yeah, I think that would have been pretty much guaranteed. And in terms of George, of course, it's a bit more complicated when it comes to George. Whether he would have done it depends on what time, that would have happened. If he'd have been contacted. But you look at the facts when it comes to George. He did form the Traveling Wilburys towards the end of the 80s. And I always suspect that was like a bit of a compromise. Maybe he did have feelings of wanting to rejoin the Beatles, perhaps. And by that time it was just not going to happen because there was no, John was gone. So this was like a compromise. He's going to form his own sort of super group, with Roy Orbison and Bob Dylan and all those guys. So yeah, there's also that, the fact that he wanted to join it, be part of a big group, not just a group or the big group for the first time really since the breakup of the Beatles. He didn't do anything like that in the 70s. I think in the 70s it was obviously not on the cards, not likely to happen because it didn't happen. But I think by particularly the later part of the 80s, I think he was definitely coming around to it. And you listen to this album, Cloud Nine. It's got When We Was Fab on it. It was a single that he released, and he was obviously having thoughts of the Beatles, and he was feeling nostalgic to that time, and I guess the excitement, and I guess he was looking back on his life with more rose-tinted spectacles and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think there was definitely this kind of re-emergence of Beatles, in their lives really. There was particularly as you can see with with our example, When We Was Fab, there was like this, I guess, desire to rekindle something that had, their past that they wanted to reignite and that sort of thing. So yeah, I don't think it was completely and totally off the cards. And I know we got, I'm aware of this album from Ringo. If anyone mentions, it's an album he put out 1973, and this is kind of the closest we got to a Beatles reunion, really, when you think about it, because all the Beatles worked on this, but it wasn't really a proper full-on reunion, because this was an album they did all work on, but they didn't really work on it together. Paul would come in and do a track with the group and with Ringo, but it would there wouldn't be the other Beatles. There wouldn't be for instance, there wouldn't be George Harrison, Paul McCartney, and John Lennon and Ringo on one track. It'd be they work on separate tracks and separate sort of elements of this album. It wasn't like a proper full-on collaboration or anything like that. It was close, but it wasn't really the reunion that many people had really wanted. But that was 1973. Past 1980, it could have been, things could have been different. Definitely with the anthology project, and just the fact that there's certain things linking the idea of a reunion. I've just gone through all the sort of aspects that could have come about really. So if a reunion did happen, say if it happened sometime in the 80s, for instance, what would it have been? What would have happened? It could have been, for instance, it could have been an album. If they got together and recorded an album, perhaps, or it might have just been something a lot more simple than that. It might have just been a performance. They could have just gone back to the Cavern Club, recorded like an hour-long gig or an hour and a half. Doing Beatles tracks, perhaps, from the history of the the back catalogue of the Beatles, recorded it and turned it into a film, and I think that would have been absolutely huge. There would have been people, definitely interested in seeing that. I think that would have been a huge event if it happened in the 80s or happened in the 90s. I think in the 90s there was definitely a growing hunger for the Beatles. You get the anthology project, which I'm bringing up again, but you didn't really get that so much in the 80s. There were compilations and there were things like that, but it wasn't as intense as it was in the 90s. I think with that extra 10 years on top, I think the hunger for the Beatles was really starting to grow by the 90s. Even more so than it was in the 80s and earlier. And if it had happened in the 90s, even, I think it would have been huge. Maybe they'd have just done maybe a charity gig at Madison Square Garden or something like that, some bigger big event. And it might not have been a permanent thing. They might have just got together, maybe occasionally and done like a couple of gigs or a series of gigs or an appearance. Maybe they'd have done, Band-Aid perhaps, in the 80s, been on the Wembley with, the likes of, Freddie Mercury and Queen and that, doing something on that. The possibilities, of course, are kind of endless, really. Who knows where they might have popped up. But it would have been something that would have been huge when it happened, and I think I think it would have been something that would have been more likely to happen than something that was, not that wouldn't happen. I'd have been really surprised if John Lennon and all the guys had lived, for decades longer, and it just didn't happen. I find that kind of hard to believe that it wouldn't have happened really in any shape or form. It might have been slight, it might have just been a one-off thing, but the idea that it wouldn't happen at all, I kind of find that hard to believe, I really do. So yeah, that's kind of it for this video. I'm maybe planning on making a third part where I talk about, what if, in terms of other bands and other artists and that kind of thing. But that's for another time, and we'll see how this one pans out anyway. I'll watch it back when after this and see how it's panned out, and see if there's any legs on this series. It probably will be the third and final part if I do make another one of these videos. So anyway, thanks for watching, and yeah, goodbye.